It usually starts in a small, almost forgettable moment, like looking down at your phone after sending a message and noticing how long it takes for a reply to come back. Not long enough to worry, not short enough to feel the same as before. Just different in a way that's hard to name. And at first, you don't think much about it. People get busy, days get full, life moves, so you tell yourself it's nothing, and you put the phone down, letting the moment pass without holding onto it too tightly. But then it happens again, and this time you notice something else. The reply, when it comes, feels slightly shorter. Not cold, not distant, just reduced. Fewer words than usual, a response that answers what you said, but doesn't quite continue the conversation. And you read it once, then maybe again, not because you don't understand it, but because you're trying to feel if something in it has changed. There's no clear sign, no obvious shift, just a subtle difference in tone that you can't quite point to. At some point, you start remembering how things used to be, how conversations would stretch without effort, moving from one topic to another without needing to be carried. There was no sense of time passing between messages, no awareness of how many words were exchanged. It just felt natural, like something that didn't require attention to sustain itself. You didn't have to think about what to say next. You didn't have to measure your words. It simply continued. Now, without any clear moment marking the change, the conversations begin to feel more contained. You notice pauses where there didn't used to be pauses. You notice endings where there didn't used to be endings. And it's not something that happens all at once. It's slow, almost unnoticeable, like something gently fading rather than being taken away. There's no single message that signals it. No final conversation that feels like a conclusion. Just a series of smaller exchanges that gradually become lighter, shorter, quieter. And because nothing is clearly wrong, there's nothing to address. You don't feel like you can ask about it. You don't feel like you should. After all, nothing happened. No argument, no disagreement, no moment that you can point to and say, "This is when it changed." It's just different now. And that difference sits somewhere in the background, quiet enough to ignore, but present enough that you can't fully stop noticing it. Sometimes you find yourself hesitating before sending a message, not because you don't have something to say, but because you're not sure how it will land. You start choosing your words more carefully, wondering if shorter replies call for shorter messages, if less energy should be matched with less energy. It's not a conscious decision, just something that slowly happens. Conversations begin to feel like something you have to adjust to, rather than something that simply flows. And in those moments, it's not the silence that feels unfamiliar. It's the space between what used to be and what is now. A space that isn't empty, but isn't filled in the same way anymore. A space where something still exists, but not quite in the form you remember. Over time, the rhythm of the conversation changes in ways that are easy to overlook if you're not paying attention. Messages become more functional, more focused on what needs to be said, rather than what simply comes to mind. You notice that questions are answered, but not always returned. That topics end more quickly than they used to. That there are fewer moments where the conversation drifts into something unexpected, something unplanned. At first, it feels like a temporary shift, like something that will naturally return to how it was. Maybe it's just a busy week, maybe something else is taking up their attention. So you wait without really thinking of it as waiting. You continue as usual, sending messages the way you always have, expecting the same kind of response to come back eventually. But slowly, almost without realizing it, you begin to adjust. You start matching the tone. Shorter replies meet shorter replies. Simpler messages replace the longer ones you used to send without hesitation. It's not something you decide to do. It just feels easier this way, more aligned with what's being given back. And in doing so, something else quietly changes. The conversation no longer expands on its own. It stays within the limits that have been set, even if no one ever said what those limits are. Sometimes you scroll back through older messages, not with a specific intention, just out of habit. And when you do, you notice how different everything feels. The length, the energy, the way one message led into another without pause. It's not that the past conversations were better in an obvious way. It's just that they felt fuller, more open, less aware of themselves. They didn't feel like something that needed to be maintained. Now there's a subtle awareness that wasn't there before, a sense that each message exists on its own, rather than as part of something continuous. You notice when a conversation ends. You notice when there's nothing more to say. And instead of naturally finding something else to continue with, the silence that follows feels more final, even if it's only temporary. There are moments when you consider bringing it up, asking if something has changed, if everything is okay. But the thought doesn't stay long, because what would you even be asking about? There's no clear shift, no specific moment to reference, just a feeling. And feelings like that are hard to explain without making them sound heavier than they actually are. So you let it remain unspoken. You continue the conversation as it is, adjusting in small ways that don't feel like adjustments until you look back at them later. And in doing so, you become part of the change, even if you never intended to be. The strange part is that nothing feels broken. The connection is still there, just quieter, less visible. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't ask to be fixed. It simply exists in a different form, one that takes up less space in your day, less space in your thoughts. And maybe that's why it's easy to let it continue this way, because it doesn't hurt in a way that requires action. It doesn't create a moment that forces you to stop and reconsider. It just slowly becomes something else, something you adapt to without fully realizing how much has changed. At some point, the realization doesn't come all at once. It settles in gradually, through small recognitions that don't feel significant on their own, like noticing that you haven't shared something you normally would have, or realizing that a thought crossed your mind, but you didn't feel the need to send it. Not because you couldn't, but because it no longer felt like it belonged in that space. You begin to understand that conversations are not only about what is said, but also about what naturally wants to be said. And when that instinct starts to quiet down, the conversation changes in a way that words alone can't fully explain. It's not about effort. It's about something softer than effort, something that used to exist without needing to be maintained. There's a moment when you look at a message thread and realize that the space between messages has become part of the conversation itself. That silence is no longer just a pause, but something that carries its own meaning. Not a negative meaning, not something that needs to be interpreted in a specific way, but something that simply exists alongside the words. You start to notice that you don't wait for replies in the same way anymore. You send a message and then move on with your day, not checking as often, not feeling the same pull to see what comes next. And when a reply does arrive, it feels familiar, but not in the same way it once did. It's like recognizing something that hasn't disappeared, but has quietly changed its place in your life. There's also a quiet awareness that the other person may feel something similar, even if it's never expressed, that they too might have noticed the change, might have adjusted in their own way. But just like you, they don't bring it up. Not because they don't care, but because there's nothing clear to point to, nothing definite to resolve. And so the conversation continues, existing in a space that is neither what it was nor something entirely new. It's somewhere in between, held together by what remains, shaped by what has slowly faded. And in that space, there is no urgency, no need to fix or define, just a quiet understanding that things don't always change in ways that can be explained. You might think about how easy it would be if there were a clear moment, a conversation that marked the shift, something you could look back on and say, that's when it happened. But there isn't. And maybe that's what makes it feel different. Because without a clear beginning, the change feels like something that was always in motion, something that didn't start at a specific point, but simply unfolded over time. And in recognizing that, you begin to see the conversation not as something that ended or diminished, but as something that moved. Not away, not closer, just somewhere else. When you sit with it a little longer, without trying to name it or change it, you start to notice how this kind of shift isn't isolated to just one conversation or one person. It reflects something broader about how connections move through time, especially when they are not held together by anything urgent or defined. There is no clear structure telling them where to go or how to stay. They exist in the spaces between routines, between responsibilities, between everything else that slowly fills a day. And in those spaces, what once felt effortless can begin to feel quieter, not because it has been lost, but because it no longer occupies the same place it used to. It's like a path that was walked often enough to become familiar, but over time, with fewer steps taken, it begins to blend back into the ground. Still there, still recognizable if you look for it, but no longer as clearly marked. You might remember a time when sending a message didn't require any thought about timing or wording. It wasn't something you considered. It just happened. And now there is a slight pause before you type, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. A small recognition that the conversation exists differently now, and that you are moving within that difference. There are moments when you almost return to how things were, a longer message, a shared thought that extends beyond the usual length, something that feels like it might open the conversation again. And sometimes it does, briefly. The rhythm shifts, the energy returns, and for a moment, it feels familiar. But then, just as quietly, it settles back into what it has become. And in that return, you begin to understand that the change isn't about one person pulling away or the other holding on. It's something more mutual, more subtle, a gradual adjustment that both sides participate in, often without realizing it. Not because they choose to, but because life moves in ways that reshape how connections fit into it. There is also something about time that changes how conversations exist. As days become more structured, more filled with responsibilities that don't leave much room for open-ended exchanges, the way people communicate shifts to match that structure. Messages become more contained because time itself becomes more contained. And what used to feel like an endless space for conversation slowly becomes something that needs to fit into smaller moments. But even within that, there is still something that remains. A familiarity in the way messages are written, in the small patterns that don't fully disappear, the way certain words are used, the way certain things are understood without being explained. It's not as visible as before, but it hasn't vanished either. And maybe that's why the change feels the way it does. Not like a loss, but like a quiet repositioning. Something that used to be in the center of your day now exists more at the edges, still present, still reachable, but not something you naturally move toward in the same way. If you look at it closely, without trying to hold on to what it used to be, there's a kind of calm in that realization. Not relief, not acceptance in a final sense, just a soft recognition that not everything is meant to stay in the same form, that some things continue just differently, less visible, less constant, but still there in a way that doesn't need to be defined. And in that recognition, the conversation stops feeling like something that is fading and starts to feel like something that has simply found a different place to exist. Later, maybe at night, when everything has quieted down and there's nothing in particular demanding your attention, you find yourself looking at your phone again. Not to start a conversation, not to check for anything specific, just out of habit. The same thread is still there, unchanged, holding everything that has been said before, from the earliest messages to the most recent ones. And for a moment, you don't open it. You just see it, the way it sits among everything else, no longer standing out in the same way it once did. It's familiar, but not something that pulls you in as strongly. Not because it means less, but because it exists differently now. When you do open it, nothing feels out of place. The messages are still yours, still theirs, still carrying the same tone, the same quiet understanding that has always been there. But the space between them feels more noticeable now, like part of the conversation itself. Not empty, not uncomfortable, just present in a way that it wasn't before. You think about sending something, just a small thought, something simple, and for a second, the impulse is there, the same as it used to be. But then it settles, not because you decide against it, but because it no longer feels as necessary. The moment passes, not with any sense of loss, just with a quiet shift back into stillness. The conversation hasn't ended. It hasn't disappeared. It's just no longer something that fills the same space it once did. And in that, there's no clear conclusion, no final understanding to reach. Just a gradual awareness that some things continue in quieter ways, without needing to be held onto as tightly. The phone screen dims after a while, returning to the same calm it had before you picked it up. And in that quiet, the thought fades with it, leaving behind nothing urgent, nothing unresolved. Just the same steady sense that something, once full, has become something softer, something that doesn't need to be explained. And as the night settles in around you, the conversation remains where it is, unchanged, continuing in its own quiet way, even when no one is speaking.